think that's a pretty difficult act to follow. I am definitely not going to be raising your spirits. At least I don't think so. I'm also not going to be using slides, but I would like you to bear that definition of extremism in your heads as I talk, because there is something about fundamental British values in what I'm going to say, although I'm going to go off at something of a tangent, because when Sharon asked me to talk, it was about how the new laws that this government have brought in are affecting the campaigning that we're involved in. So I'm kind of going to do a quick tour of that, but I'm not going to do it in my own words. The words of Michael Forst. He's the UN Special Rapporteur on Environmental Defenders. I think his words will carry more weight than mine. But actually, I really want to flip this conversation on its head. And that's why it's subtitled, Who Are the Extremists? I've got my glasses on because I've made notes in an effort to stay on time. But I think I'm going to give you my answer to that before I get going. I don't think it's going to surprise you if I say that I think that it's the political decision makers, it's the people like Michael Gove, that are the extremists in this. And I'm going to also tell you a couple of stories about that, because I think stories are really powerful. And it helps us to understand kind of why I say that. But context is kind of everything when you're talking about these sorts of issues. So here's something else that I want you to hold in your heads while you're listening to what I'm going to say about those who are effectively ringing the climate fire alarm and the difficulties that they are facing. So this context starts for me on Wednesday, Wednesday just gone, when The Guardian published the results of a survey of about 380 climate scientists from across a range of disciplines and across the world. It's a really big survey. I'm really surprised it has not got more traction. But I want to tell you a bit about it, because unsurprisingly, their overwhelming feeling was fear. And one of them said, I expect a semi-dystopian future with substantial pain and suffering for the people of the global south. And actually that kind of nails it on the head, and it reflects the majority view of the scientists in that survey. The enormity, and I'm quoting again, the enormity of the problem is not well understood. So there will be environmental refugees by the millions, extreme weather events escalating, food and water shortages, before the majority accept the urgency in reducing emissions, by which time it will be too late. I'd really recommend reading that, and I'm happy to share the link if you would like to look at it yourself. So nothing uplifting about that, but it provides the context to what is happening. So,
is provision of weapons good or bad?
Can I come back to that a bit later, because I think that will derail quite a lot of the discussion and take up the time, but that is a really interesting question, because one of the things that we need to talk about is the intersectionality, the cross issues that we will face, and that actually the climate crisis will make so much worse. But I'm just going to carry on with what I wanted to say first about where we're heading with this extremism, because I don't think you have to fall within the government's list of who is extremist to effectively be targeted by the government in a way that you would expect them to target extremists. So Michael Forst made a visit to the UK in January 2024. As I said, he is the UN Special Rapporteur on Earth Defenders, and this is from his end of mission statement, some of what he said. And you'll have to forgive me, I'm going to have to read because I can't actually remember all his words, but I think they summarise the current landscape that we face. He says, in the UK, peaceful protesters are being prosecuted and convicted under the Police Crime Sentencing and Courts Act 2022 for the criminal offence of public nuisance, which is punishable by up to 10 years imprisonment. I was also informed that the Public Order Act 2023 is being used to further criminalise peaceful protest. In December 2023, a peaceful climate protester who took part for approximately 30 minutes in a slow march on a public road was sentenced to 6 months imprisonment. It is important to highlight that prior to these legislative developments, it had been almost unheard of since the 1930s for members of the public to be imprisoned for peaceful protest in the UK. He goes on to describe what I think is one of the most invidious things that's happening, which is the way that bail conditions are being used to silence climate protests. He describes them as harsh bail conditions imposed on peaceful environmental defenders while awaiting criminal trial. And often, the sentence that these people receive is non-custodial. So when he says that these have included prohibitions on engaging in any protest, from having contact with others involved in their environmental movement, or from going into particular areas, some environmental defenders have also been required to wear electronic ankle tags, some including a 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. curfew, others GPS tracking. And under the current timeframes, he says, of the criminal justice system, environmental defenders may be on bail for up to 2 years from the date of their arrest to their eventual criminal trial. I can add the fact that people are remanded in custody for periods of time. Under the current system, protesters are often remanded in prison for weeks before being released on bail. And the reality of the bail conditions is actually worse than he describes. He says that such severe bail conditions have significant impacts on environmental defenders' personal lives, mental health, and he says, I seriously question the necessity and proportionality of such conditions for persons engaging in peaceful protest. Well, I have friends who are on these tags, and I know that malfunctions in the automatic system that's used and the checks that are imposed often mean that they're faced being woken up 3 and 4 times a night consecutively for long periods of time. Can you imagine that? That you go on a peaceful kind of non-violent but disruptive protest, and the consequence is that not only are you imprisoned for 2 or 3 weeks before you get bail conditions, but when you're released, you are put in a position where you're on a tag that restricts your movement, and to check that you are complying with it, there's the system that phones you up, and it'll go at 2 in the morning, then it'll go at 3 in the morning, it might wait till 5. It's random, you don't know when it's happening. Well, that seems to me pretty extreme. So Mr. Forst goes on. In addition to the new criminal offences, I am deeply troubled by the use of civil injunctions to ban protests in certain areas, including on public roadways. Anyone who breaches these injunctions is liable for up to 2 years imprisonment and an unlimited fine. Even persons who have been named on one of these injunctions without first being informed about it, shocking, isn't it, which to date has largely been the case, can be held liable for the legal costs incurred to obtain the injunction and can face an unlimited fine and imprisonment for breaching it. The fact that significant numbers of environmental defenders are currently facing both criminal trial and civil injunction proceedings for their involvement in climate protest on a UK road or motorway are being punished twice for the same action is also a matter of grave concern to me. And that's not all, because you've got this legal system that's been used against climate protesters. We would prefer the term climate defenders, but climate protesters. But as Michael Forst points out, and again I'm going to use his words, I am also distressed to see how environmental defenders are derided by some of the mainstream UK media and in the political sphere. By deriding environmental defenders, the media and political figures put them at risk of threats, of abuse, and even physical attacks from unscrupulous persons who rely on the toxic discourse to justify their own oppression. The toxic discourse may also be used by the state as a justification for adopting increasingly severe and draconian measures against environmental defenders. In the course of my visit, I witnessed firsthand that this is precisely what is taking place in the UK now. This has a significant chilling effect on civil society and the exercise of fundamental freedoms. So this isn't my movement saying this. This is the UN rapporteur. And I'm going to come back to what I think has happened as a result of the government using that justification, that toxic media discourse. But first, let me tell you a story, my first story. It's a true story, happened to a friend of mine. You can actually read about it in a lot of the papers. So in March 2023, a retired social worker by the name of Trudy Warner, she stood outside with a placard outside a criminal court in London. On the placard was a statement that can be found on the wall of the Old Bailey. It's one of our safeguards against democratic government, against dishonourable judges and abuse of power, and it refers to a trial in 1670. So it's been ingrained in our system. It's been one of our constitutional safeguards since then. And the relevant parts of that plaque on the Old Bailey wall say, Chief Justice Vaughan delivered the opinion of the court, which established the right of juries to give their verdict according to their convictions. And Trudy's side said, jurors, you have an absolute right to acquit a defendant according to your conscience. It's not exactly the same wording, but pretty much the same sentiment. Now, Trudy was there because there was a trial of some climate activists that was due to take place in that court building. But as recorded by the CCTV outside the court, she didn't try to speak to anyone coming into the court. She didn't try to engage with any prospective jurors, anyone going into the court. She just held a placard that stated the law. Yet for over a year, Trudy was left facing the prospect of criminal prosecution for holding that placard. The British government, through the Solicitor General, decided to make an example of her, and they commenced proceedings for contempt of court, which carries a really significant penalty. They wanted her jailed, even though all she did was to hold up a placard outside a court stating something which is commonplace in legal textbooks and on the wall of the Old Bailey. Now, fortunately for Trudy, it's not just up to the government and to the Solicitor General. A judge has to be satisfied that the threshold has been met before a case for contempt can proceed. They have to show that there are reasonable grounds and that it's also in the public interest. And so 3 weeks ago, a High Court judge found that the Solicitor General did not even show that there were reasonable grounds, let alone any public interest. It's really good judgment, but it's solidly against the government. He described the government's case as not even coming arguably close to meeting the test for reasonable grounds. At one point, he described it as a mischaracterization of what Ms. Warner did that morning. And at another point, he even used the word fanciful to describe one of their claims against her. Even more striking is that in relation to public interest, he said that, and I quote, it was a disproportionate approach to this situation in a democratic society. So that's where our government has taken us. Now, Trudy, I'm happy to report, is resilient and is now pretty determined to support others who may find themselves in that same position. But there is a really high personal cost to that. And it has an incredibly deterrent effect on others exercising their public voice. So my second story, a bit of an eye on the time, is about the courage of our young people and some of the consequences for them. There's an ongoing trial at the moment, and it involves a young woman, Phoebe Plummer, who's 22, and another young woman, Chiara Sarti, who's 24. And they took part in a 20-minute Just Stop World March along the Cromwell Road in West London last year. So some of you will know the Cromwell Road. It's not like a motorway. There are ways around it. It's not one of our key highways. But for this they were arrested and they were held in prison for nearly 3 weeks before they were granted bail. And they're now being tried under a new provision which the government introduced in the Public Order Act 2023, Section 7, which covers acts which prevent or significantly delay the operation of key infrastructure. Things like airports, printing presses, oil and gas infrastructure are listed there. But the government has also chosen to include roads. Not just particular roads, but roads generally as a key infrastructure. So they're being prosecuted under this quite serious provision of interfering with key infrastructure for their 20-minute walk on the Cromwell Road. And I think one of the interesting things about this story is that Rishi Sunak has confirmed last year that the think tank Policy Exchange, its conservative think tank, helped to draft his government's laws in targeting climate protests, of which this is one. Now, Open Democracy has reported that the Policy Exchange has received donations from ExxonMobil. So this is a really difficult nut to crack, but it might have something to do with these definitions of extremism and why we are being kind of told that certain people are extremists, climate protesters. We're not yet, but why we think we might come into the frame fairly soon. So, I think in the last 5 minutes, I hope that you will have time to process some of what I've said, because it is quite a worrying context and background to some of the things that Margaret Ann talked about. But I do want to tell you about the government's, some of their most recent laws directed primarily at climate protesters, but also actually at the Palestine protests, I think. So they're called Serious Disruption Prevention Orders, and they came into force in April. And it's a new order which gives the courts the power to place requirements or restrictions on an individual, which they consider necessary and proportionate. I won't use my fingers to indicate inverted commas, but it's what they consider necessary and proportionate to prevent that individual from causing serious disruption. And incidentally, serious disruption has been defined by the government not as significant, but as anything more than minor. So, yeah. Now, the orders can be imposed after 2 convictions for protest-related activities. Relatively easy to come by now, a conviction for protest-related activity. Many climate protesters have convictions for willful obstruction of the highway, but the new laws the government have brought in make it very easy if you're in a protest somehow. Okay. Find yourself on the wrong side of the law. The order can last for 2 years, and it can be used to prohibit an individual from being in a particular place, being with particular individuals, participating in particular activities, having particular articles with them, using the internet for protest activities. None of these particularities are actually defined beyond that. So you can see where this could go. So when you look at increasingly repressive legislation like that, I have to ask, who are the extremists here? Now, in case it all feels doom and gloom, because I was told that I have to be a bit uplifting. And so far, and particularly, given the context that I've set out and the fact that the people who are involved in these actions, I hope will include everybody, all of you, given how serious the situation is. I think that I need to go back to that survey that was done with climate scientists, and the words of a Mexican scientist who's foregrounded in the article that the government, the Guardian published. And she said these words, and I think we really have to hold on to this, because it's so easy to give into despair, to say the fight is too hard in the face of what is happening to us, in the face not just of what's happening to us with the climate, but in the face of what's happening to us every time we try and say we have to do something about it. We have to kind of care for the weakest in society, because there's something about this that says this government, governments around the world think, actually we'll survive. Those people over there, those weak, poor people, the black people, the people in the global south, we've got to look after ourselves. I think in a way that reflects something that Kevin said about where hate comes from fear, from self-preservation at the cost of the world. Anyway, back to the Mexican scientist. I really don't know, she said, what needs to happen for the people that have all the power and all the money to make the change. I agree with her that I really don't know what has to happen. It's pretty desperate. But then she goes on to say, but then I see the younger generations fighting, and I get a bit of hope again. So my last word's going to be what we have to do, I think, in our generation, is to safeguard the ability of those young people to fight back. Not just join them in the fight, but to safeguard their ability to fight. So there we go.